Um, so here we have this question of analysis and synthesis in 16th century anatomy. Why analysis and synthesis? Well, this talk comes from a paper which will be published in a collected volume on analysis and synthesis in the history and philosophy of science. And in the 17th century, I think as many might know, there was a huge amount of discussion about the importance of analysis and synthesis in the sciences and in mathematics and to some extent in logic. So Alan Shapiro has identified, and many and others have sort of pointed out, four main traditions of analysis and synthesis discussions: chemistry, natural philosophy or physics, mathematics, and logic, with distinct accounts of what analysis and synthesis is and what it does. But roughly, in chemistry, we have a physical, a decompositional, as Shapiro writes, analysis and then a resynthesis from those physical components. Whereas in the other traditions, you have a more conceptual analysis or a regressive analysis, search for well, as we'll see with Newton, who combines all four of these sort of willy-nilly. He says, as in mathematics, so in natural philosophy, the investigation of difficult things by the method of analysis ought ever to precede the method of composition. This analysis consists in making experiments and observations and drawing general conclusions from them by induction. By this way of analysis, we may proceed from compounds to ingredients and from motions to the forces producing them, and in general from effects to their causes, and from particular causes to more general ones, till the argument end in the most general. This is the method of analysis, and the synthesis consists in assuming the causes discovered and established as principles, and by them explaining the phenomena proceeding from them and proving the explanations. So here we have a notion of causes, which is in the logical tradition, effects and causes. You have notion of forces and motions, which is from that natural philosophical tradition, composition and decomposition from chemistry, ingredients, compounds to ingredients, and all of this really being blended together in a really not very rigorous philosophical way, as many have pointed out. So, and this really influences so many discussions about the how to go about analyzing nature, understanding nature, Kant onwards, and so it becomes so important as a sort of a rhetoric. So what about anatomy? Well, there was a fifth medical tradition, discussions of analysis and synthesis that others have pointed out. But I want to suggest that anatomy might be even distinct from that medical tradition of analysis and synthesis. So how has this anatomy as analysis and synthesis been discussed, and how can we think of it? Well, generally it tends to be talked about in terms of analysis as practice. Here I'm referring to more recent scholars discussing these things. Analysis as practice and synthesis as somehow involving theory, the practice of dissection, the theory of sort of combining the analyzed parts into some coherent whole of the body. So analysis dealing with structure, synthesis dealing with action or actio, along with teleology, the purposes. So you might also talk about in terms of induction, analysis as induction and synthesis as deduction. This is one way of thinking about it, but it doesn't really hold when we look at least the figures that I'm examining here. So there's quite a bit more messiness and many different ways of thinking about what is going on with analysis and synthesis. So, and then analysis and synthesis merely as teaching methods, which I think is very important. And as this volume that I'm a part of is revealing, so important, the analysis and synthesis as just merely preoccupations for teaching and learning. So in general, anatomy was taught theoretically by the synthetic method, beginning with the elements, qualities, and similar parts to organic parts, which is said to follow the nature in her construction of the body. Practical anatomy was analytic and followed a sequence of dissections in which the similar parts were, in theory, the final product. So that's Roger French talking about analysis and synthesis as teaching methods. But even this doesn't really doesn't really hold in the figures that I'm talking about in the second half of the 16th century. So what were the sources for the figures that I will be discussing in the 16th century and early 17th century? The sources here mostly come, or the ancient sources here, mostly from Galen. So Galen talks about it in at least two places, really two influential places. The Ars Medica, everybody was reading, every physician was reading this. And he talks about three types of teaching, dealing with analysis. One is coming from a notion of the end by analysis. You start from the ends and you analyze. The second is putting together the findings of the analysis. And the third is definition, the dialysis of a definition, which is his chosen one. And then you have a really interesting discussion of analysis and synthesis in the affections and errors of the souls. He talks about an example from architecture. Then the Paduans that I will discuss as well took inspiration in their methods, which I will argue, and maybe I don't actually believe this argument, but I will argue can be understood in terms of analysis and synthesis. And here they're combining Galen's on anatomical procedures, his on the doctrines of Hippocrates and Plato, and on the usefulness of parts, with Aristotle's account of dissections, or his work, or somehow something dealing with dissections, which is lost. We don't really know what it was. With his history of animals, his Dianima and the Parva Naturalia, and the parts of animals, and as well as some discussions in the posterior analytics. So these are these ancient sources for these discussions. There is another source which became really important for 17th century accounts of analysis and synthesis in mathematics and in physics, and that was Comodino's translation of Pappus's Collectiones Mathematicae. Oh, that's I got a typo there. Mathematicae. But this wasn't influential at all on our medical figures here, our anatomists. And in fact, I don't know that it's particularly well studied to the degree to which Galen's discussion in the passions, the affections and errors of the soul might have influenced the mathematical tradition, because Pappus's account is coming, it seems, from a similar tradition described earlier by Galen in his affections on the errors of the souls. Like, this is what we read here. He talks about analysis and synthesis, that those who wish to become expert in scientific proof should monitor their own progress, practicing first, as I have suggested, on a number of individual questions where the right answer has a self-confirming status, which the inquirer can recognize, as is the case in mathematics and geometry, which astronomy and architecture in turn use as their basis. So he's talking about here, gives an example of creating a public sundial, and you have to move from an analysis to discover certain things, and then a synthesis, and then you come up with, you encounter other problems, practical problems about how to implement your parts of the sundial. Then you do another analysis, and then a synthesis, and you have other issues, another analysis, another synthesis. So it's a continual move through analysis to discover, and then to prove that what you're doing is, in fact, will in fact work properly. So this seems to be really influential on, it might have been really influential on certain debates. I don't know of any real good account, but I could be missing something. But whether or not it affected the figures we see here, I'm not certain, as a matter of fact. But it is one source. So I'm framing a lot of this in terms of this question, or this issue of an epistemic circle in early modern anatomy. What is this epistemic circle? Well, we can start by looking to Aristotle and Galen on the problem of death. And here I'm just giving a quote from Aristotle's Meteorology 4, where he talks about perfect mixts, which move into his discussion of simple parts of the body, homogeneous parts, sort of this homogeneous parts of the body. So he says that their essential reality, that is the homoamorous bodies, is comprised in their formal definition. This is always clear in the higher products of nature and, generally speaking, in things which are instrumental and serve a particular end. Thus, it is only too clear that a corpse is a man in name only. So a hand of a dead man is a hand in name only. And he says, all of these things, in fact, are determined by their task, their ergon, sometimes translated as function. And the true being of each consists in its ability to perform its particular task of the eye, for instance, in its ability to see. While if it cannot perform its task, it is that thing in name only, like a dead man or a stone figure of a man. So to flesh out what this epistemic circle is, you have this account of this desire to account for the activities and the ends of the parts of a living body. And that has to be reconstructed using evidence gathered from a dead, dissected body. But this reconstruction itself involves some physiological theory, some assumptions. And this theoretical account, on the authority of Galen and Aristotle, should be based on sensible evidence. And this sensible evidence involves some dissection. So how do you break this epistemic circle? Well, understanding anatomy as analysis, you could break it on the analytics side as, these various problems. First, I'm going to discuss. One is that the dissection might not cut nature at the joints. In fact, cutting nature literally at the joints would be a problem, a really big problem for your anatomy, because you destroy important structures. So structures may be destroyed by your dissection. Structures may be created, reorganized by the anatomist's knife. Death might hide structures. The lymphatic system, only really discovered in the 17th century. That's a whole system of the body that, because death just sort of made the lymphatic system difficult to detect. Can alter apparent connections, as we'll see, the origin of the optic nerve in the brain. Can be used to argue that structures are hidden, such as the portion, the septum of the heart, the optic foramen, the hole in the optic nerve, supposedly all difficult to see in death, but supposedly there in a living body. So another problem is spirit or pneuma, really the most important substance in the animal body, was said to exit the body rapidly after death. So how can you account for the living body when this really fundamental substance is gone? And then, as we saw with Aristotle, really the fundamental issue is that the form, what it is to be of the part or organ, passes away upon death. That's anatomy as analysis. As synthesis, you have a fundamental problem. You cannot perform a literal synthesis of the body. You cannot be Dr. Frankenstein in the 16th and 17th century. Even the idea of Dr. Frankenstein does not exist. So can a synthetic anatomy be empirical? In what sense? Ways to cut this circle in general. Well, you have a really careful observation of living bodies, but that window is limited, especially the relationship between structure and action and use. You have perhaps vivisection experiments, ligating the recurrent nerve, really cutting, in a sense, taking away the power of the nerve to cause the vivisected, usually dog, to have a voice, or use its voice box, and then removing that ligation, then the voice returning. That's really can be seen as a sort of analysis and synthesis. But these kinds of experiments were limited, they were difficult, and often were always found in Galen. So there weren't really that many new vivisection experiments in the 16th century. You could use your experience from medical practice. Surgery can be thought of as a kind of synthesis. One task of surgery was to unite the parts of the body that become separated. But again, this is not really a systematic program. You could observe diseases that removed capacities of parts and organs. This was often argued, but again, not systematically, not in a way that necessarily resolved debates over what's going on in the body. So you have imperfect contested results because there was no well-organized program for doing these things. So now I'm getting to the meat of the talk, 20 minutes in. That was all sort of preparatory material. So what are the anatomies that I will discuss? We have Costanzo Varolio, André du Laurens, Girolamo Fabrici d'Acquapendente, and Giulio Casserio. And I'm looking at their accounts of the eye because that's my specialty, but also because a limited sort of section allows us to not just look at their rhetoric of analysis and synthesis, but to see whether or not their actual anatomies in the sections of their anatomies on the eye, what they were doing there, and whether or not what it involved, what their analysis and synthesis actually involved on some particular part of the body. Starting in general, though, what was anatomy? Is it necessarily empirical dissection? Is it autopsia? Well, no, not in the 16th century. Nancy Cerisi has pointed out a really important sense of anatomy as just an anatomy of texts. But as well, you just get anatomy as, especially with regard to the eye, as just an image with the names and a sense of what is contained in what is containing here. So here we have just a labeled image called an anatomy of the eye. And this, especially because the eye was not necessarily a part of the elite physician's purview in the 16th century, these lower status sort of surgical specialists relied on treatises like this to get their knowledge of the eye, perhaps. So here we just have a labeled image, and it's derived from Gregor Reich's work on the liberal arts, his natural philosophy textbook. So this is one sense of anatomy. It's just a labeled image. Now you could have that built up in a labeled image with some textual description. Here we have Georg Bartisch's work on ophthalmology. And here we have a really interesting virtual dissection of the eye, where you lift the flaps, and I've cut out some flaps to get to the various parts of the eye. At the end of this section where he has his flap image diagrams and some limited textual description, therefore one has the entirely complete, clear, and actual report of the entire eye as constructed, created, and positioned. Henceforth, it must be a very simple, rough, and ignorant person who does not want to prepare himself with these figures and descriptions or be able to follow them. Again, there's no sense of autopsia here. And in fact, these images were derived from Vesalius, modified, I have argued elsewhere, to accommodate Bartisch's probing with the cataract needle and his other experience with the eye. But largely, there's no sense that it is derived from a physical dissection of the eye. And we have no evidence that Bartisch ever dissected an eye, not in his works. So what is the source of Bartisch's images in Vesalius? Well, here we have another sense of analysis and synthesis, or anatomy as an image and a sense of analysis and synthesis coming in. So I'm using a later pirated edition as the image just so I can get everything on one page. So on the top, you have this sort of cosmic eye, as Vesalius describes it. And he says he draws this image before he teaches the eye to his students. So you're preloading, he was preloading his students with this sort of structure of the eye to get them to understand this messy dissection more clearly. So he is theoretically sort of preloading them and predisposing them to see what was in the image. And so you still have this image tradition being really important in this anatomies of the eye in Vesalius. But in the bottom sequence, we have this divine craftsman sequence where you're constructing the eye from the interior outwards. But read in reverse, you also have a replication of Vesalius's instructions for dissecting the eye. You denude it, you cut it transversely along the axis, and then so on and so forth. You reveal the parts. But of course, this is not what you would see in an actual dissection. It would be all the parts would be fluid, things would be torn. It's a very difficult dissection, and you need really sharp knives to even, and it's very easy to mess things up. So here we have arguably a sense of analysis and synthesis combined in a single image. But again, it's the importance of this image tradition that I'm sort of trying to point out, that anatomy isn't necessarily about discovery, or sorry, anatomy as analysis and synthesis is not necessarily about discovery in this image tradition, certainly. So turning to Varolio, we have this dual sense of anatomy as discovery versus anatomy as the resolution of final causes in his two major works. So he got his medical degree from the University of Bologna, chair in surgery there, and then in medical practice, was responsible for teaching anatomy. And then he was somehow associated with the Roman Curia after that. So his two major works, De Nervis Opticis, Observatis de Nervis Opticis, and he gives as well observations of other parts of the head. It's originally a letter to the physician Girolamo Mercuriale, really well-known 16th century physician. It belongs to the Observationes genre, as Gianna Pomata has outlined Ian MacLean a bit before her. And she says that the rise in fortune was linked to the development of horizontal networks of exchange among European scholars. It involves report of first-hand observation, an informal and agile format, and a limited yet ambitious goal, the communication of anatomical discoveries, and a form of collective empiricism. His other work, his Anatomia sive de resolutione corporis humani, the resolution of the human body. This was a manuscript given to a secretary to Pope Gregory VIII, who was, quote, a devoted student of the liberal arts and especially anatomical matters. This is a really teleological anatomy. So let's go through these really quickly. In De Nervis Opticis, Varolio has this really fascinating figure, at least in the published version. I don't know if it was how it was related to the initial letter. But in the published version, you have on the right, our right, the left part of the brain, the traditional account of the optic nerve and the nerves entering the brain. And on the left, you have Varolio's account. And the really important thing here is we see this is where the traditional account has the optic nerve entering the brain. And Varolio brings it all the way back around the brainstem. And this has really important ramifications for the location of the ventricles of the brain, particularly where the common sense is, typically located towards the front of the brain. So the common sense is in the rear. You have to reorganize what is going on, what you thought was going on. So this really has major implications if the optic nerve enters in this different part of the brain. What does he write in here? Well, he gives a new way of dissecting the head. The common method of dissecting the head, both by the ancients and the Neoterics, was to begin with the upper parts by first removing the upper part of the skull, then the membranes, followed by the substance of the brain as far as the ventricles. And the brain, by its weight, especially in the dead, compresses the organs. That's the issue. That's the big problem that he has. And so he says you should begin the dissection from the opposite side of the head, that is from the base of the brain, by which manner of proceeding each of its organs is observed so perfectly that nothing more seems to be wanting. But this method of dissection, as it is different from the common one, is also most difficult. So here he talks about this really first-hand experience of showing his students where the optic nerve enters the brain, where the optic nerves originate. His students reported to the other anatomists at Bologna, and these anatomists object, claiming that these students had been deceived by Varolio. And so they gathered many people together, in acquiring human heads and dissecting all together in a communal manner, and they strove to persuade everyone of the falsity of my discovery. But he comes back, he has the opportunity, has several bodies, began a public dissection, and he says, even though the brain was shriveled and because of the ambient heat somewhat putrid, I once again made it so clear to everyone that those who had seen it before were entirely reassured in this truth, and those who had not believed it prior both had peace in their soul and stood up for the truth. So that was his one published work on the brain and particularly the optic nerves. His other one published work, which is posthumously published, is Anatomy or the Resolution of the Human Body. He says he's proceeding as a way to first propose the end, and then he calls us the method of dissolution. He starts by collecting the number and quality of the powers of our soul, and then analyzing those powers of the soul, and showing that it must be constituted out of such and such a number of parts, neither more nor fewer, nor or in any way disposed, so that starting from one part, you may gradually perceive the necessity of all the others, down to the smallest and most secret things. So really an analysis of final causes to arrive at the material parts. So what is this resolution of the human body? It's not a physical dissection. It's not fundamentally a historia of the parts. It is gathered by first-hand dissection or culled from other anatomical texts. It's a conceptual analysis showing the necessity of the parts. So final causes are treated as given. And here's the final cause of man is to contemplate the power and divine essence of the workman who created us. And these final causes are analyzed into material descriptions of homogeneous parts. These are just coordinated with the account of what is one is supposed to find. So the properties of the parts of the eye, when he discusses the eye, are necessitated, we find, by the nature of light, color, and perception imported wholesale from natural philosophy. He's not doing natural philosophy. He's just taking what is supposed to be the case from the natural philosophers. So his goal here, unlike in the previous work, is to inform a general audience that has religious and particularly theological interests. Moving to du Laurens, here we have a different sense of anatomy as, he says, artificial analysis. So really, really important figure for the history of anatomy in this period. He ended up being a physician to Henry IV of France and chancellor to the University of Montpellier. Finally, physician to the king, first physician to the king in 1606, a really powerful, influential figure. His first opera Anatomica, published in 1593 in Lyon. That's the one I will be analyzing, Lyon and London. Later, all this material was incorporated into his expanded account, his Historia Anatomica Humani Corporis. And then, later into his opera Anatomica later in the 17th century. So these were highly successful because they were really useful pedagogically. They were comprehensive, had all the Greek terminology, adhered strongly to Galen, defended Galen against the supposed attacks of Vesalius and Falloppio, and provided a new model for how to deal with anatomical, or provided not a new model, but an old model, but a model for how to deal with anatomical philosophical controversies. So it had this component to it. So what do we see in his first published work on anatomy? He says, it is easy, believe me, if anatomy is explained by way of order and method. Note he's combining order and method here, which will be separate later, as we see. So he says there's a twofold method of learning and teaching anatomy, one being analysis or resolution, which resolves the whole into its parts. The other, genesis or composition, which composes the whole out of similar and dissimilar parts. We shall cut the human body into 4 principal parts. We will cut these again more minutely until we have reached the simplest ones, in each one continually observing the order of the section. Later, So that's his account of anatomy as analysis. But he also says that anatomy has two definitions. Or it denotes either an action which is accomplished by the hand or an attitude of mind and the most perfect action of the intellect. Former is practical, the latter theoretical. So in the first way of practical anatomy is defined as the artificial section of the external and internal parts. I call it an artifice which separates the parts from the parts in such a way that each one is seen wholly and not in any way mangled. The second way, analysis as theoretical, anatomy as theoretical, is defined as the science which examines and investigates the nature of each part. With the word nature, however, I include many things: substance, size, number, composition, connection, position, temperament, action, and use, of which only the first 7 are demonstrated in the deceased in the sense of autopsia. So, and then you have to judge the rest by the visible and the living, which, again, as we saw, is difficult. So what we have here, judged by both reason and sense. So you have to involve reason here. So what do we have here with these two figures and their anatomies? Well, for a professional audience, Varolio prioritizes novel dissection techniques discovered via physical dissection, which we might think of as analysis, and then firsthand experience and accounts of particulars, proof by autopsia. When teaching or conveying information to a general audience, Varolio prioritizes the importance of final causes in the order of nature, conceptual resolution, and resolution is just the Latin word for analysis. So these two terms were often interchanged, so resolution and analysis. And then uncovering the material necessity of the parts via this resolution. Now for du Laurens, his order and method for teaching is analytic. This analytic method is chosen for pedagogical reasons, because you can follow along in a actual dissection of the human body. The genetic or the compositive method is not taken up by du Laurens. Anatomy can be either practical or theoretical, and du Laurens seems to embrace both, but neither fully. So his work is a guide to dissection and an aid to investigate the nature of the parts scientifically, but it does not do either of those in a real rigorous manner. But the important thing is that in neither is analysis or resolution framed as a method of discovery or as necessarily physical. It can just be this analysis in a text, a taking apart, a cutting apart in a conceptual sense or in a textual sense of taking the pre-existing body of knowledge and presenting it in a certain way, in a way that analyzes, puts things in the order of analysis. So that's really the key takeaway from both of these accounts of when they talk about analysis. So we move to Acquaviente, who perhaps the most famous anatomist of his day, and in his first surgeon, physician, anatomist at the University of Padua, the most famous and sort of renowned medical school in Europe at the time. So in his first work, published work, De Visione, published alongside De Voce and De Auditu, he writes, our discussion will be in 3 parts. We proceed to the he first reveals the structure of the eye by dissection. He moves to the action of the eye, which is vision itself, and then the usefulnesses of the eye, or the utilitates of the eye, of the parts of the eye and the whole. He hunts all these things through dissection, he says. Indeed, dissection, if one judges correctly, has the advantage that it makes evident not only those things which belong to the eye, that is structure and history, but it also leads to an acquaintance with the actions or faculties, and finally uncovers and declares the utilitates of the eye. We begin, however, to dissect the eye exactly as it presents itself to sight. In De Voce, he, in the preface to that, he also says that dissectio is distinct from historia. It should be distinct from historia. So dissectio gives an account of dissecting an organ, and it shows how many ways it can and should be done. And this dissection is provided for this end, that one might uncover the other three, that is, history, action, and utilitas. And he says, anatomy, in my opinion, is nothing else but a true and solid foundation for the whole of medicine and the absolute perfection and consummation of natural philosophy. So anatomy is so fundamental to everything for Fabricius. He's really elevating what anatomy ought to be here. Oh, and so there's these four parts are also, he says, though distinct, they are so accommodated to one another and so conjoined that they cannot be separated in any way. So what is his account of dissection or dissectio? Well, I argue elsewhere that his images in this work function as an account of how to dissect the eye. And so you have all of these ways of looking at what you dissect. And this is, as we'll see, replicated in his text in a very limited sort of textual account. But these diagrams function as a guide to the reader on how to dissect. And we can see this in his account of these two images of a cow's eye, images 31 and 32, both cow's eyes, but they're different. There's sort of particulars. He had artists stay with him and make sketches of his anatomies as he needed them. So we have these two identical dissections on 31 and 33, but they're dissected in slightly different ways because they are individuals. These are, in a sense, reports of individual dissections, I argue, which is very interesting. It's not idealized here. The idealization comes when you perform, especially the useful, when you come for the usefulness or the utilitates of the parts. So here we have his account of dissection, no references whatsoever to any texts, just an account of how you should dissect. That is in contrast to his history or his Historia, where you have constant references to all of his predecessors, a thorough accounting of all the sensible properties of the parts with references and arguments with all of his sort of important predecessors. And of course, Greek terminology, super important at the time. In his section on the action of the eye, what the parts of the eye do, what their activities are, he gives a natural philosophical sort of disputation. Here we have the manner of vision according to the opinion of Aristotle. He gives that, and then he gives his own, arguing that his is better than Aristotle's, his own opinion on the eye. And so he's doing natural philosophy. He's doing natural philosophy, but he's relying on the empirical data, or you might say, the empirical sort of storehouse of information that he gathered in his Historia. He's using that to do his natural philosophy in the actio section. And then in the final section on the usefulness, the ends or the utilities of the parts, he engages in a discourse on optics. Here, he has to account for refraction in order to understand what the purposes of the shapes and sizes and refractive powers of the parts of the eye are. And so we have all of these diagrams and arguments imported from the perspectivists, the mathematical optics, but he also challenges them, and that's really important. Here we have finally these abstract images of the eye only in the utility, or the section on the utilitas of the parts of the eye. So that's quite interesting. So very quickly, because I'm running a little late. So he dissects the eye, gives you kind of the temperament, shape, sizes, connections. For the actio, he, in a sense, resolves the puzzles and controversies by moving to a natural philosophical discourse grounded in his empirical Historia. And then for the utilitas, or the usefulness of the parts of the eye, he moves to often to a mathematical optics discourse, treatises in mathematical optics, using again his previous sections, the historian, the Actio, to make arguments about the new, to sort of discover the new usefulnesses of the parts. Some of them are quite new. And so on. So this is what he's doing. And this can be seen as a sort of analysis and synthesis, physical analysis, and then a sort of a conceptual synthesis, referring to, or by appealing to these different domains of knowledge, previously separate. So in Casserio, who was Fabricius's student at one time, and then his sort of rival in Padua, he was a surgeon, physician, and labeled himself a natural philosopher as well, anatomist. So in his first work on voice and hearing, he says he follows a twofold method in this work. The first can be plainly called active and operative history, which displays the body's fabric with great accuracy and produces so detailed an acquaintance with even the smallest parts that, as a result of the skillful dissection of these singulars, they can be separated out even on a living body. Such a method ought truly to be called the anatomical method. And then the second method, which he does not like to call anatomical, he says is altogether contemplative and intellective and belongs to the acuity of the mind alone, neglecting the work of the hands. It probes by means of the temperaments, that which follows from temperament, and accidents, and pays out usefulness or utilitates. He says he's following Galen here, but he's, of course, an interpretation of Galen. Later in his work on the five senses, the pentasthesian, he states that he manually uncovers the fabric of the body according to the judgment of sense. So part of this anatomical method, the first part that is truly anatomical, really involves keen judgments of sense. It's not just manual, it is a sense of a judgment, a sensible judgment, which is really important, and which is something I think he argues you can be trained. You have a skill in judging by sense. And then he says, progressing from that which falls under sense to that which the mind contemplates, I first investigate the actions, then the uses of the parts in accordance with temperament and what follows from temperament and accidents. So here, just sort of reduplicating what he said earlier. So what does it look like in his actual anatomy of the eye in the pentasthesian? Well, he first gives anatomical tables before his account of the Historia. So he has these anatomical tables with multiple ways of dissecting the eye. So he multiplies the ways of dissecting the eye. Like Aquacapendente, he is doing a comparative anatomy, but he involves more animals, in particular fish and chickens, which have very small eyes. So it's a very sort of a testament to his skill that he can dissect such small parts. And importantly, the shapes of the crystalline humors in those animals is quite a bit different. But you see this multiple ways of dissecting the eye. And this is, I think, an argument that you need to dissect the eye from multiple sides and angles in order to get a full account of what's going on. You need to do it many times in multiple ways. So the second section, the second part of the first section, which discusses the fabric of the eye, is very much a traditional sort of account where he's citing a lot of important figures in the past, giving a thorough account in writing of what is found. In the Actio section, he first question says whether this treatise pertains to natural philosophy. He answers in the affirmative ultimately. And the entire treatise is just a really thorough natural philosophical discourse. It's pure natural philosophy. He does rely on some of his results, but he doesn't necessarily focus on incorporating or grounding his natural philosophical discourse in his Historia. So there's 52 different disputed questions that he goes after here. He ends up by saying vision is made by reception and emission. Galen and Plato do not disagree, and Aristotle was also of this opinion that there's a dual emission and reception occurring in a sense within the eye, an intraocular emission theory, or sorry, infraocular emission theory, which is interesting, but not unprecedented in the 16th century. So, and then when he gets to the uses of the parts, the usus, the sort of final causes, what purpose the parts serve, he incorporates what he has before, but it's really pretty perfunctory. There's not that much that is new. He's not necessarily discovering new uses. He's just fully grounding it scientifically. It's a full scientific grounding. So you can be rest assured that because you did your natural philosophy and you have your historia really accurately captured through the anatomical method, then you can get the mind can contemplate things securely here. So I think I've gone over all this. His project requires a skilled anatomist along with an adept philosopher, and the two occur in the same person for Casserio, but they don't necessarily have to. I think that's an important point. The anatomist does not necessarily have to be an adept philosopher. They are, in a sense, separate roles being played, whereas that's not the case for Acquapendente. He also emphasizes vivisection much more, and surgery, and a kind of skill is really, really important, more emphasized than it is in Acquapendente. So very quickly, some conclusions. How did he break the epistemic circle? How did these figures that we have discussed break the epistemic circle? So Varolio, we have novel dissection technique or skill and authority. And du Laurens, it's just authority that breaks this circle. So it's not in these sense in their anatomies that the epistemic circle is not necessarily broken in a real way, and that's not the point of these works. The point of these works is not to aim for discovery or to necessarily provide the solid grounding. It's really an introductory text. In a sense. Now, with Acquapendente, we get the epistemic circle being broken in a variety of ways. One is in the skill of dissection and comparative anatomy. Meticulous historia, really good judgment of all the sensible properties. Shift to different disciplines using historia as a basis for these deductive accounts. So you use natural philosophy for the actio, optics for the utilitas section. And then also, again, relying on comparative anatomy, so you can get a more philosophical, natural philosophical sort of grounding for all of this. For Casserio, he breaks the epistemic circle via his skill in dissection, via meticulous historia as before, but also moved to a different discipline, a sort of related but distinct discipline, which is natural philosophy for the actio section, with appeals to historia as needed, but not as sort of called for as we see in, at least in his account of vision. I think his account of, he's much more concerned or much more involved in his hearing and voice in a sort of discovery. His discoveries were primarily in accounts of the hearing and voice. So those may look different, actually. Now, he also synthesizes philosophy and anatomy in order to resolve questions of usus. So he brings together anatomy and philosophy to get the kind of usefulness of the parts, and he uses comparative anatomy. What else can we say? Well, the rhetoric of analysis and synthesis was not generally empirical. So when people use the rhetoric of analysis and synthesis, which Casserio and Acquapendente did not, it was not in the 16th century, at least in these figures I look at, empirical. It was for teaching, as Galen says. Anatomy cast as analysis of resolution was a theoretical account. It accommodated dissection or autopsia in parallel, but it did not demand it. Anatomy as a synthesis with either domain of nature or of a conceptual assembly, as we see in Salius. Now, the rhetoric of analysis and synthesis was generally concerned with teaching. So it was called the method. It largely concerned the order of presentation for teaching and learning. And then this would be really a crucial point that Zabarella made, that we ought to, the famous natural philosopher Jacopo Zabarella, logician and natural philosopher. So after Zabarella, and perhaps in dialogue with or in concert with, not necessarily just following, we don't really know, but the Paduanatists appear to have reframed their accounts of order and method, following or along with or fully in accord with Zabarella's distinction between order as purely an order for teaching, for best learning and teaching, and method which allows for discovery. And I would just want to mention Fabrizio Bigotti's work here. I don't really have a chance to get into it, but maybe he'll have some questions about this, because I have some things to say there. So we can identify a combined practice of physical resolution and conceptual composition in the Paduan medical and anatomical philosophical tradition. What we saw in Acquabendente and Casserio is, in a sense, compatible with Zabarella's famous account of the regressus method in some ways, but translated from logic into natural philosophy. But I don't think we have to read it that way. It's not clear that they would have accepted this framing, that it was directly related to the regressus method. This is tricky to work out. They certainly don't use resolutio, compositio, analysis, synthesis, anything like that. And even analysis would be tricky. So I think, in addition to the 4 traditions of analysis and synthesis that are we can identify, the medical is sometimes called a 5th. And this analysis of the rhetoric of analysis, this is derived from the medical tradition in anatomy, but I think it's somewhat distinct. So I think here's another work by Helen Hattab about analysis and synthesis from Zabarella to Spinoza, which gives us some insight here. And it's the medical or the anatomical tradition is, I think, distinct from what's going on in all of this. So maybe a 6th tradition. Now, the practice, as we saw in Acquabendente, Casserio, also, although Gagliotti and William Harvey, who studied in Padua, I have been calling this analysis and synthesis. This does not seem to have impacted discourse on analysis and synthesis in the 17th century, as far as I can tell. But it did discussions of method generally, and it did influence how natural philosophy was practiced overall in the 17th century, even if it isn't framed in terms of analysis and synthesis, which again is my imposition, which perhaps is sort of only for the sake of discussion and might not be helpful in the end. Anyway, that's what I have. Thank you very much.